The cattle stood like statues carved from shadow and dust, their breath misting in the pre-dawn chill. There were 212 of them, spread across the basin where the last of the deep spring water pooled, their coats a model of brown and white and brindle that blended with the dry land. They were calm, their horns long and elegantly curved, their eyes placid. They were the only calm things for 100 miles. Beyond the line of Alara's fence, the world was a study in desperation. Her neighbors' fields were baked clay, cracked into a mosaic of ruin. Dust devil-spun where herds of prize-winning Angus and Hereford had stood just 6 months before, now sold off for pennies a pound or left to starve. Alara watched them from her porch, a mug of coffee warming her hands. Mr. Sterling, the agent from the Cattlemen's Association, had just left, his truck kicking up a plume of angry dust down her long drive. His offer had been an insult wrapped in false concern, a threat veiled as advice. A woman alone can't see a herd this size through a drought like this, he'd said, his voice smooth as oiled leather. Sell to me. I can manage the risk. She had just looked at him, her gaze as steady as the horizon, and said, the price is not for you. He had not understood. He thought it was about money. It was never just about money. She took a slow sip of coffee. The sound of the pump kicking on was the most beautiful sound in the county, a steady, rhythmic heartbeat drawing life from the earth. 2 years earlier, it had all begun with a death rattle. The air in the auction yard was thick with the smell of manure, fear, and cheap tobacco. It was a place of endings. Old dairy cows whose milk had run dry, bulls grown too mean or too slow, calves orphaned or rejected. Alara stood at the back, her hands shoved deep in the pockets of her canvas jacket, feeling the weight of every scornful glance. She had inherited her father's quarter section, a patch of hardscrabble ground everyone said was good for nothing but breeding rocks and disappointment. He'd left her that, and a mountain of debt that sat on her chest in the dark hours of the night. The auctioneer's patter was a hypnotic, meaningless river of sound until a gate clanged open and a single, miserable creature was prodded into the ring. It was a heifer calf, no more than a few weeks old. Its coat was the color of faded buckskin, its bones stark beneath its hide. It stumbled, its breathing a wet, ragged sound, a death rattle in a tiny chest. A ripple of contemptuous laughter went through the crowd of weathered ranchers in their clean Stetsons. What is that thing? One man muttered. A sick goat. Sterling, holding court near the front, chuckled. Looks like something the coyotes already had a go at. The auctioneer didn't even try. What am I bid for this specimen? $1? Someone give me $1 to get it out of my sight. Silence. Then from the back, Alara's voice, clear and steady. $5, every head turned. The ranchers, the buyers, Sterling. They all stared as if she'd just proposed setting fire to the town hall. Sterling's smile was a condescending slash. Don't throw your money away, little lady. That thing's carrying pneumonia. It'll be dead by morning. $5, she repeated, her eyes fixed on the calf. The creature had lifted its head, and for a moment its dark, liquid eyes met hers. There was nothing in them but a flicker of life fighting to stay lit. The auctioneer, eager to be done, banged his gavel. Sold to the girl in the back for $5. Get out of here before it falls over. Getting a home was a slow, careful misery. She backed her old truck up to the pen and, with the help of a grudging yard hand, lifted the calf's feather-light body onto a bed of straw in the back. It was like lifting a bundle of sticks. All the way home, driving slow over the rutted roads, she listened to that awful, hitching breath and did the arithmetic. $5 for the calf, $10 for the penicillin and electrolytes at the feed store. That was $15 she didn't have, $15 that meant another week of beans and biscuits. It was the math of a fool, and she knew it. The whole town knew it. As she pulled up to her small, unpainted house, her nearest neighbor, Mr. Alto, was out mending his fence. He was a Finn who had come over 30 years ago, a man who spoke little and saw much. He watched her carry the limp calf, wrapped in a horse blanket, from the truck bed to the barn. He didn't laugh. He just nodded slowly, his eyes the pale, washed-out blue of a winter sky. That night, she sat on a stool in the dim, lantern-lit barn, patiently syringing a mixture of warm milk and electrolytes into the calf's mouth, a few drops at a time. The little creature lay on a deep bed of clean straw, its life hanging by a thread so thin Clara could feel it fraying with every ragged breath. The barn was cold, smelling of old hay and dust, and the loneliness of the place was a physical weight. One person alone. That's what they saw. A woman who had inherited a failing plot of land and was now spending her last dollars on a dying animal. She could hear their voices from the auction yard, the pity sharp as ridicule. She's her father's daughter, all right. Stubborn and broke, she closed her eyes, focusing on the task. The arithmetic wasn't just about money. It was about hope. One calf. If it lived, it could be the start. One cow, then two. Two, then four. It was a long, slow equation, the kind that required more faith than capital. By the third day, the death rattle had softened to a wheeze. The calf, which she had started calling Hope in a fit of desperate, private irony, could now hold her head up for a few minutes at a time. Clara spent every spare moment with her, sleeping on a cot in the barn, her hand resting on the calf's bony flank, feeling for the faintest rise and fall of her chest. The mockery from town was a low, constant hum. When she went to the general store for supplies, conversation would halt. Men would tip their hats with an exaggerated politeness that was worse than an open jeer. Mrs. Gable, who ran the store, gave her a pitying look. Heard you bought yourself some livestock, dear. Anything special? Clara met her gaze. She's a piney woods that's brought a fresh wave of disbelief. The breed was an old one, half-wild, considered by modern ranchers to be little more than scrub cattle. They were smaller, leaner, and slower to mature than the big, blocky Herefords that Sterling and his syndicate prized. They were known for one thing, surviving on nothing. Goodness, Mrs. Gable said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Well, I'm sure you know what you're doing. On the fifth day, Mr. Alto appeared at the barn door, holding a small bucket. He didn't say a word, just came in and looked down at the calf. Hope was sleeping, her breathing almost even now. He knelt, his old joints cracking, and ran a hand over the calf's spine. His touch was gentle, knowing. She has good bones, he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured to the bucket. It was full of a thick, pungent herbal mash. For the lungs. My grandmother used it. Clara looked from the old man to the bucket. Thank you, he nodded, his eyes scanning her setup, the clean straw, the fresh water, the lantern hanging safely away from the hay. The land doesn't care about your pride, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. It only answers your work. He stood up and left as quietly as he had come. Clara mixed a spoonful of the mash into the warm milk. Hope drank it all. That night, for the first time, the calf tried to stand on her own four wobbly legs. Clara watched, her heart in her throat, as the creature struggled, trembled, and then stood, swaying but upright. It was not a victory anyone else could see or measure, but for Clara, it was everything. It was proof that the arithmetic of hope, however foolish, could sometimes yield a real and tangible sum. She had won. By June, Hope was a different animal. The pneumonia was a ghost. Her coat had filled in with a healthy sheen, and she had the boundless, clumsy energy of any healthy calf. She followed Clara around the small pasture like a large, devoted dog. She was still small for her age, lean and athletic where a Hereford calf would be thick and square, but she was vibrantly alive. The town's mockery had not ceased, but it had changed its tune. Now, it was about the foolishness of the breed. Still got that little deer cow. A rancher named Cobb asked her outside the feed store, a smirk playing on his lips. Fattening her up for what? You'll get more meat off a good-sized jackrabbit. Clara didn't rise to the bait. She just nodded. She's doing fine. Being right is its own kind of reply. She didn't need to argue. She had work to do. Mr. Alto's words had taken root in her mind. It only answers your work. So she worked. She rose before the sun, the cool air sharp against her skin, and walked her property line every day. She didn't see barren rock and scrub brush. She was teaching herself to see what the piney woods cattle saw. She found patches of native grasses the commercial breeds ignored, saw edible browse on the tough, drought-resistant shrubs, and noted the places where water seeped from the rock after a rain. She read old, forgotten books on land management, Books from before the time of chemical fertilizers and massive irrigation. Books that spoke of rotational grazing and soil health as a living system. She divided her largest pasture into 4 smaller ones with scavenged wire and posts, a task that left her hands raw and her back screaming. The idea was to graze one section intensely for a short time, then move the animal, allowing the land to rest and recover. It was an old way, a slow way. It was the opposite of how men like Sterling ran their vast operations, with hundreds of cattle grazing huge pastures down to bare dirt. Her work was quiet, solitary, and all-consuming. One afternoon, a boy appeared at her fence line. He was maybe 10 years old, with hair the color of sun-bleached straw and a shy, watchful intensity. It was Sam, the youngest son of the Hendersons, whose farm bordered hers to the east. The Hendersons were proud, struggling people, their land as poor as hers. "Is that her?" he asked, pointing a small, dirt-smudged finger at Hope, who was contentedly stripping the leaves from a mesquite branch. "That's her," Ilaris said. "They say she's a piney she is." He was silent for a long moment, just watching. She looked smart. It was the kindest thing anyone had said about the calf. Ilara felt a smile touch her lips. She is smart from then on. Sam was a frequent visitor. He never asked for anything, just sat on the other side of the fence and watched Ilara work. He watched her dig out a stubborn patch of thistle, mend a broken gate, and clear stones from a small plot where she planned to plant a garden. One day, she was struggling to haul a heavy roll of wire. Without a word, Sam slipped under the fence and took the other end. They worked in comfortable silence. He became her shadow, a small, quiet presence who seemed to understand the rhythm of her days. He helped her name the small flock of chickens she acquired, giving each a ridiculously grand name like General Fuzzbutton or Queen Cluctoria. The gentle irony made Ilara's quiet life feel a little less lonely. That autumn, she did the hardest arithmetic yet. Hope needed a future. A single cow was a pet. A herd was a business. She found what she was looking for 2 counties over. A rancher selling off his small herd of Piney Woods cattle, including a young bull. He was old, his children wanted nothing to do with the worthless breed, and he was selling them for a song. The price was still more than she had. She sold her father's old pocket watch, a few pieces of her mother's jewelry, and the one good saddle she owned. It felt like selling parts of herself. She drove home with a bull and 2 more heifers in a borrowed trailer, her stomach in knots. She was all in. There was no turning back. Sterling saw her drive through town. He was standing on the boardwalk outside the saloon with his cronies. He didn't laugh this time. He just watched her pass, his eyes narrowed in a look of cold, calculating curiosity. The secret was getting harder to keep. The town had moved from mockery to a kind of perplexed waiting. They were all waiting for her to fail. It was easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. The first calves arrived the following spring, small and hardy, up on their feet and nursing within an hour of birth. Hope, her first calf, proved to be an excellent mother, watchful and protective. The sight of them, dotting the greening pasture, was a balm to Ilara's soul. She had 5 cows now, plus the bull. The arithmetic was finally starting to look favorable. She kept her success like a coal banked low under ash, shielding it from the wind of public opinion. She sold a few bull calves quietly, for cash, to a small family farm far to the south, driving them herself in the dead of night. The money went directly to paying down a sliver of the debt and to buying more fencing. The work was a constant, grinding rhythm. Fence, move cattle, check for sickness, haul water. Her hands, once soft, were now calloused and rough as bark. Sam was her constant companion. He had a preternatural gift for spotting a calf in distress or a break in the fence line. He never spoke of his own home, but Ilara saw the worn-out clothes and the hungry look in his eyes when she shared her simple lunch of bread and cheese with him. She started packing extra. One afternoon, while they were resetting a corner post, Sam asked, "Why do they call them worthless?" He was looking at the herd. They were browsing peacefully, spread out, eating things Ilara's neighbors would have called weeds. "Because they don't look like the others," Ilara said, sighting down the fence line. "They don't get fat as fast. People like Sterling, they sell beef by the pound. More pounds, more money. It's simple math for them, but they're not simple," Sam said. "They eat the thorny bushes. Mr. Cobb's cows won't touch them. No, they won't, she agreed. They're bred to eat rich grass and corn. These ones, they're bred to survive. It was a truth she was banking on. That summer was hotter than usual, the rain sparse. The grass in her neighbors' fields turned brown early. Her own pastures, because of the rotational grazing, held their green longer. The resting sections were storing moisture deep in their roots, waiting. It was a small difference, but it was a visible one. People noticed. The talk in town shifted again. The open mockery faded into a grudging, resentful silence. Her small herd was healthy, their coats sleek, while some of the neighboring ranchers were already starting to supplement their feed with expensive hay, grumbling about the cost and the dry weather. Her generosity was tested one evening when Mr. Henderson, Sam's father, appeared at her door. He was a proud, frightened man, his face a mask of exhaustion. He held his hat in his hands, twisting the brim. He wouldn't meet her eyes. "My well pump's broke," he mumbled. "Parts won't be here for a week. My cows, they're thirsty." Clara knew what it cost him to ask. She nodded. "There's a gate on our shared fence line. Open it after your evening milking. Let them drink from my stock tank. Close it again in the morning." He looked up, stunned. He had been one of the men laughing at the auction. I can pay you." "No," Clara said quietly. "Thirsty animals aren't a business negotiation. Just see they don't break the fence." He left without another word, but the next morning, a basket of fresh eggs from his wife's hens was sitting on her porch. It was a small thing, but it felt like a crack in the wall of scorn that had surrounded her for so long. She was still one person alone, but perhaps the definition of alone was beginning to change. That was the year the man from the city came. He drove a clean black car that looked entirely out of place on the dusty, rutted road. He wore a crisp white shirt and a frown of intense concentration. He was a chef, he explained, from a fancy restaurant in the capital, and he was looking for something real. He'd heard a whisper, a rumor from the farmer she'd sold the bull calves to, about a woman raising old-fashioned cattle the old-fashioned way. "They say the meat is different," he said, skepticism warring with hope in his voice. "They say it has flavor. Everything now tastes of corn and confinement." Clara was wary. She had culled a young bull that season, one whose temperament was too hot for her herd. The meat was hanging in her small, cool smokehouse. She said nothing, just led him to it. She cut a thick slice of steak from the loin and fried it in a cast-iron skillet with nothing but a little salt. She didn't have to sell it. The aroma did the work for her. It was rich, earthy, complex. He ate the first piece in silence, his eyes closed. Then he opened them, and they were wide with a convert's zeal. "My God," he whispered. He tasted the thing, and he was instantly converted. "What do you call this?" "Beef," Clara said, with the slightest hint of a smile. He offered her a contract on the spot, a price per pound that was nearly double what Sterling offered for his prime Hereford. He wanted every animal she could spare. He wanted exclusivity. It was the moment she had worked for, the validation she had bled for. The arithmetic had finally, definitively come out in her favor. But as she looked at the signed paper in her hand, a cold knot formed in her stomach. The sky to the west was a pale, cloudless, unforgiving blue. It had been that way for 43 straight days. The drought was no longer a threat. It was here. The contract changed everything. Word of it spread through the county like wildfire, carried on currents of disbelief and envy. Clara Jennings, the foolish girl with the scrub cattle, had a private buyer from the city paying a premium. It didn't make sense. It violated the established order of things. A thing's only worth what others will pay, and for 2 years, the town had agreed her cattle were worth nothing. Now, an outsider had declared them a treasure. Mr. Sterling was the first to act. He drove out to her ranch, his truck unnaturally clean, his smile polished to a high sheen. He didn't mention the chef. He pretended it was a social call, a neighborly visit. He leaned against her fence, looking out at her herd. They were spread across a rested pasture, browsing on the tough, dry forage. They looked lean but healthy. "Fit. Getting to be a fair-sized herd you've got there," he began, his tone oozing false warmth. "Must be a lot of work for someone alone." There it was again. Her supposed weakness. "I'll manage," she said, her voice even. Of course," he said quickly. "But a drought year is coming. We all see the signs. Feed prices are going to skyrocket. Water's going to be worth more than whiskey. An operation this size, it carries a lot of risk. A big loss could wipe you out. He let the thread hang in the air. I'm here to make you a fair offer. I'll buy the whole herd. Every last one. Take the risk off your hands. You'll walk away with a nice little nest egg. No more worries, he named a price. It was a lowball offer, barely more than what he'd pay for common stock at the auction, a fraction of what the chef was paying. It was an offer built on the assumption that she was a weak, frightened woman who didn't understand her own worth. She looked at him, her face calm, and let the silence stretch. She thought of the cold nights in the barn, the raw skin on her hands, the weight of the town's scorn. She thought of Hope's first wobbly steps. "Thank you for the offer, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice quiet but firm as bedrock. "But they're not for sale." His smile tightened. The warmth vanished, replaced by a flicker of cold anger. "Don't be a fool, Clara. You're in over your head. When your well runs dry and your cattle are starving, my offer will be off the table." He turned and left, his confident stride betraying no hint of defeat, but she had seen it in his eyes. He wasn't used to being told no, especially not by her. The drought settled in like a malevolent presence. August arrived like the open door of a furnace. The sun beat down from a mercilessly clear sky, bleaching the world to shades of tan and gray. The creek that cut across the corner of her land slowed to a trickle, then vanished, leaving a cracked, muddy scar. Her neighbors' stock tanks, fed by shallow wells, began to run dry. The big Herefords and Angus, bred for lush pastures, stood listlessly in the shade, their ribs beginning to show. The price of hay tripled. Panic began to set in. Clara's preparations were now her salvation. The deep well her father had dug, the one everyone said was foolishly deep and expensive, continued to pump cool, clear water. The rotational grazing system she had so painstakingly built now paid its dividend. The rested pastures, their root systems deep and healthy, still held pockets of life. Her piney woods cattle, with their lower water requirements and their ability to thrive on browse, were untroubled. They stripped the leaves from mesquite, chewed on prickly pear cactus, and sought out the tough, dry grasses the other cattle wouldn't touch. They were doing what they were bred to do. Sam was with her every day now. His own family's farm was failing. Their well was dry, their cattle sold off. He worked with a silent, desperate energy, as if the rhythm of labor on her ranch was the only thing holding him together. He never had to be told what to do. He saw the loose wire, the thirsty chickens, the gate that needed oiling. One evening, as they watched the cattle drift in for water, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "My dad. He says you're a witch." Clara looked down at the boy. His face was streaked with dust, his eyes old with worry. "Because my well isn't dry? Because you made something out of nothing," he said. "He says it isn't natural." She put a hand on his shoulder. "It's not magic, Sam. It's just work. And listening. The land tells you what it needs. If you listen, that was a truth the other ranchers had forgotten. They had tried to command the land, to force it to yield what they wanted. She had simply partnered with it. The drought was the land's answer to their commands. By the third week of the drought, the county had become a landscape of despair. The buzzards circled high in the sky, patient. The sound of cattle trucks, hauling away entire herds for slaughter prices, was a constant, mournful drone on the main road. Pride, which had been the county's primary crop, was withering on the vine. Hunger changes a town. It strips away the easy certainties and leaves behind the hard, sharp edges of need. The whispers about Clara were no longer tinged with mockery or envy. Now they were laced with fear and a strange, resentful awe. She had water. She had healthy cattle. In a world that was dying of thirst, she was an anomaly, and that made her a target. Sterling began to move against her more openly. He used his position at the Cattlemen's Association to spread poison. He'd stand in the feed store, his voice pitched for all to hear, talking about the need for community resources in a time of crisis. "It's not right," he'd say, "for one person to hoard water while their neighbors' herds die." He was painting her as a selfish hoarder, a villain, conveniently forgetting that he had been the first to try and profit from her position. He organized a town meeting. It was a tense, grim affair held in the dusty town hall. Clara went, sitting alone in the back row. Sam had wanted to come, but she told him to stay and watch the herd. She knew this was a fight she had to face herself. Sterling stood at the front, all smooth talk and false concern. He spoke of shared sacrifice and the common good. Then he turned his attention to her. Clara has been fortunate, he said, his voice dripping with insinuation. She has the last deep well in the district, and a herd of over 200 head drinking from it every day. He let that sink in. 200. The number, spoken aloud, sounded impossibly large, impossibly greedy. How did you know the count? Alara's voice cut through the murmuring. It was not loud, but it was clear and carried to every corner of the room. Sterling froze. The question was a trap, and he had walked right into it. The official county livestock census was months out of date. The only way he could know her exact number was if he'd been spying on her, counting her animals, assessing her worth for his own predatory purposes. The mask of the concerned community leader slipped, revealing the cold-eyed speculator beneath. It's my business to know the state of the local herds, he stammered, but the damage was done. The farmers and ranchers in the room were a lot of things, but they were not fools. They understood the language of fences and property lines. They understood the difference between a neighbor and a vulture. The mood in the room shifted, subtly but irrevocably. They might resent Alara's success, but they despised Sterling's naked opportunism even more. A few days later, the real blow fell. Not from Sterling, but from the bank. A letter arrived, formal and cold. Due to the declared agricultural disaster in the county and the perceived high risk of her outstanding loan, they were calling it in. The full balance was due in 30 days. It was a death sentence. The contract with the city chef was her future, but the payments were quarterly. She didn't have that kind of cash on hand. No one did. She sat at her kitchen table, the letter flat on the wood grain, and did the arithmetic of ruin. There was no way to make the numbers work. She would have to sell the herd. And the only person with enough cash in this drought-stricken county to buy it was Sterling. He had won. He had found a way to break her that had nothing to do with water or grass. He had used the cold, impersonal machinery of finance. That night, she didn't sleep. She walked the fences under a sky littered with cold, distant stars. The air was still and hot. She listened to the gentle sounds of the herd, the soft tearing of grass, the huff of a cow contentedly chewing its cud. This was what she had built. Not just a herd, but a sanctuary. A living, breathing answer to everyone who had ever called her foolish. She thought of Mr. Alto's words, spoken so long ago. The land doesn't care about your pride. It only answers your work. She had done the work. The land had answered. And now the world of men, with its papers and its rules, was going to take it all away. It was not a matter of pride. It was a matter of justice. As dawn approached, staining the eastern sky a pale, hopeful pink, an idea began to form. It was a desperate gamble, a wild and improbable long shot. It was a plan that relied not on her own strength, but on the very community that had once scorned her. It was the only move she had left. She found Sam by the stock tank, skipping stones across the unnaturally still water. He looked up as she approached, his young face etched with the same worry she felt. "Is it true?" he asked. "About the bank?" News, especially bad news, traveled fast. "It's true," she said. She sat on the edge of the tank beside him. "Sterling will buy them all now, won't he?" "He thinks he will." Clara picked up a small, flat stone. "Sam, I need you to do something for me. I need you to go to your father, and to the Cobbs, and the Wileys. I need you to tell them I'm holding a sale. Tomorrow at noon. Right here." Sam looked at her, confused. "A sale? But who has money to buy cattle?" "They do," Clara said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "They just don't know it yet." The next day, at noon, a small collection of trucks and wagons gathered in her yard. The faces were grim. Henderson was there, and Cobb, and a dozen other ranchers who had lost nearly everything. They stood in a tight, awkward knot, avoiding her eyes, their pride warring with a desperate curiosity. Sterling was there, too, leaning against a shiny truck, a smug, proprietary smile on his face. He thought this was her surrender, a public auction where he would be the only bidder. Clara walked out onto her porch. She didn't have a gavel or a sales book. She just had her voice. "Thank you for coming," she began, her tone steady and clear. "As most of you know, the bank has called my loan. I have to sell my herd. Sterling's smile widened. He pushed himself off his truck, ready to begin the bidding. But Alara wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the tired, defeated faces of her neighbors. I'm not selling to the highest bidder, she said. The crowd grew still. Sterling's smile faltered. I'm selling breeding pairs. One bull, one heifer. I'm selling them for $100 a pair. A collective gasp went through the crowd. It was an absurdly low price, a fraction of their true value, even in a drought. It was a gift. That's insane, Sterling sputtered. They're worth 10 times that. They're worth what I say they're worth, Alara replied, her eyes flashing. And their price isn't cash. Now the crowd was utterly baffled. The price, she continued, her voice ringing with a newfound authority, is a promise. A note, signed by you due in 2 years. You take the cattle, you rebuild your herds with animals that can survive this land, and you pay me back when you're on your feet again. It was an act of impossible generosity, of radical faith. She was betting on them, on the very people who had laughed at her. She was offering them not a handout, but a partnership, a chance to reclaim their dignity. Henderson was the first to step forward, his face working with emotions he couldn't name. I'll take a pair. Cobb was next. Me too, then another and another. They were choosing her and her strange, hardy cattle over the system of money and power that Sterling represented. They were choosing hope on credit. Sterling was apoplectic. This is a joke. Those notes aren't worth the paper they're written on. The bank won't accept them. You're right, Alara said, turning to face him at last. The bank won't. But there are more than 100 pairs for sale here today. The notes will be my security. The bank will get its money from the rest of the herd. She looked past him to the road, where a clean black car was pulling up, kicking up its own plume of dust. The city chef got out, his checkbook in his hand. He had come for the first shipment of beef on his contract. The cash from that sale, combined with the sale of the remaining stock to him, would be more than enough to satisfy the bank's demand. It was a perfect, elegant solution, a piece of arithmetic no one but her could have devised. She had saved her ranch, saved her neighbors, and outwitted her antagonist, all by choosing generosity over greed. Sterling stood there, his face pale with fury and disbelief. He had been so certain of her weakness, of his own power. He had miscalculated. He had assumed she was one person alone, but she had taken the town's scorn and transformed it into a bond. She had refused to be alone, and in doing so, had bound them all together. He got in his truck and drove away without another word, defeated not by force, but by a simple, profound act of kindness. The ranchers, her neighbors, stood taller. For the first time in months, there was a flicker of hope in their eyes. They were writing out their promissory notes on the hood of a truck, their hands clumsy, but their signatures firm. They were choosing a different future, a future built on tough, resilient animals and the quiet strength of a woman they had once called a fool. The drought broke that winter, as all droughts eventually do. The rains came, soft at first, then steady and soaking, turning the cracked earth dark and fertile. The land, given a chance to rest, responded with a riot of green. The pastures came back thicker and healthier than before. The county began to heal. The herds of Piney Woods cattle, scattered across the neighboring ranches, thrived. They were a living testament to Alara's foresight. The lean, hardy calves born that spring were a promise of recovery, a symbol of a new kind of wealth not measured in sheer pounds, but in resilience. Alara's own herd was smaller, but her ranch was secure. The bank was paid, the debt was gone. Her contract with the city chef provided a steady, reliable income. But her real wealth was in the quiet nods of respect she received in town, in the way her neighbors now sought her advice on pasture management, in the basket of preserves or fresh-baked bread that was always appearing on her porch. She had become the anchor of the community, not through power or money, but through the patient application of work and wisdom. Mr. Sterling's influence withered. His monopoly on the cattle market was broken. When people had a choice between his way, the way of boom and bust, of big, vulnerable cattle and big, crushing debt, and Alara's way, the slow, steady, resilient way, they chose Alara. His brand of simple, predatory arithmetic no longer held its appeal. He eventually sold his holdings and moved away, a man defeated by a world that had become too complex for his simple greed. One afternoon, Clara stood with Mr. Alto on the rise, overlooking her home pasture. Below, her herd grazed peacefully. Sam, now a tall and capable teenager who was her de facto ranch foreman, was patiently repairing a section of fence, his movements economical and sure. The sun was warm on their shoulders, and the air smelled of wet earth and growing things. Hope, the original calf, now a mature and dignified matriarch of the herd, stood near the fence, watching Sam with her intelligent dark eyes. She was the foundation cow, the living proof of a foolish $5 bet that had paid off beyond all measure. "You have done a good thing," Mr. Alto said. It was high praise from a man of so few words. "The work was good," Clara said, echoing his own long-ago lesson. He nodded, a slow, satisfied smile creasing the corners of his eyes. He looked out at the healthy land, the healthy animals, the thriving ranch that had been built from nothing. He looked at the young woman beside him, no longer a girl, but a leader, her face calm and confident, her hands still rough from work. "Yes," he said, his voice a quiet rumble of confirmation. "The land doesn't care about your pride. It only answers your work. And here is its answer." The answer was everywhere she looked. It was in the green grass, the clear water, the contented lowing of the cattle. It was in the steady presence of the boy who had become like a son, and the quiet respect of the old man who had been her first believer. It was a victory that made no sound, a triumph not of gloating, but of quiet, abundant life. She had started with a death rattle and ended with a heartbeat, the strong, steady pulse of a community reborn, of a ranch saved, of a life built not on what could be taken from the land, but on what could be grown with it together. She was no longer one person alone. She was the center of a circle, held fast by the bonds of shared hardship and earned respect, rooted deep in a land that had, at last, given its answer. The arithmetic of hope had been calculated, and the final sum was peace. The years that followed were good ones. The cycle of the seasons turned, each bringing its own challenges and rewards. Clara's methods, once seen as eccentric, became the local standard. Ranchers spoke of the Clara way when they talked about rotational grazing or choosing hardy breeds. The promissory notes were all paid back, some early, with interest offered and gently refused. The relationships forged in the crucible of the drought had been tempered into something strong and lasting. Sam stayed on, growing from a boy into a young man who knew the land as well as Clara did. He absorbed her lessons not just about cattle, but about patience and observation. He became the son she never had, the future of the ranch secure in his capable hands. The cattle themselves became local legends, their mottled hides and long, curved horns a familiar sight across the county. They were no longer scrub cattle. They were survivors, their value proven in the harshest of terms. The town did not forget. They had been humbled, and in that humility, they had found a better way. The memory of the great drought served as a constant reminder that the flashy, easy way was often the most fragile. Clara had never married. Her life was full, her heart content with the family she had built from strays, a dying calf, a lonely boy, a silent old Finn, and a town of chastened skeptics. Her bond was with the land itself, a deep and abiding partnership. She had learned its language, and it had, in turn, entrusted her with its abundance. The city chef's restaurant earned a national reputation, in no small part due to the unique, flavorful beef he sourced exclusively from Clara and the network of ranchers she had helped create. He would often bring important guests out to the ranch, not just to see the cattle, but to meet the woman who had revolutionized their thinking about where good food comes from. On these occasions, Clara would be polite but reserved, letting the land and the animals speak for themselves. She would serve them a simple meal in her kitchen, a perfectly cooked steak, fresh bread, vegetables from her garden. The guests, often wealthy and worldly, would eat in a kind of reverent silence, tasting something pure and real that their money could not ordinarily buy. They were tasting the result of her work. One cool autumn evening, years after the drought, Clara was walking the fence line, just as she had done every day for as long as she could remember. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke and curing grass. She came to the spot where Mr. Alto, long since passed, had first spoken his piece of wisdom to her. She could almost feel his presence there, a quiet, reassuring solidity. She looked out over her domain. The lights were coming on in the small ranch house, where Sam was likely starting dinner. The herd was drifting toward the barn, their dark shapes moving slowly through the tall grass. It was a picture of profound peace, of earned security. She thought back to that day at the auction, the smell of fear, the sound of laughter. She remembered the fragile weight of the dying calf in her arms, a burden that had become her foundation. It had all seemed so impossible then. The arithmetic had been so stark, the odds so long. But the simple, stubborn act of caring for one small, worthless thing had somehow tipped the scales. It had been the first step in a long journey that had saved not only her, but an entire community. The land had answered her work, and the answer was a quiet, enduring, and deeply satisfying grace. She had proven that true value isn't always loud or obvious, that resilience is a greater virtue than size, and that generosity is the most profitable currency of all. The story of Alara Jennings and her Piney Woods cattle became a quiet legend, a frontier parable told on winter nights, a story not of conquest, but of partnership. It was a story about a woman who listened to the land, who saw value where others saw none, and who, by refusing to